We're going to break up this lecture of Texas after the Civil War into two units. One is going to be how did it operate in the West with growth, expansion, and agriculture in Texas after the Civil War to 1900, to the turn of the century. And then how did it break up and how did it operate regarding big business, labor unions, and things of that nature. That will be the second part of this lecture. So this one I'll talk specifically about the West and expansion of Texas post-Civil War. So where we'll start is where we ended last time regarding the indigenous people, and that is the end of the Indian Wars. And really what happens with this is after the Civil War, the indigenous people, more attention is drawn to the issue of settlement as they try to increase settlement in Texas again, and the raids that were happening regarding Comanches and Apaches. And so there were many things that happened, including the intentional destruction of bison, which I talked about last time. But the other thing that also happens is that, the acquiescence of the Comanche and the Apache. The end of the Comanche really was, or the end of the acquiescence and going on to reservations was the 1875 Red River War. And that's where famous Comanche Quanah Parker finally acquiesces to the white people, and interestingly enough, he was actually half white. His mother was somebody who was kidnapped by the Comanche at a young age, Cynthia Parker. But then also in the summer of 1880, with the use of buffalo soldiers, the Apache are stopped and they're actually chased down to Mexico. The Mexican troops attacked them and killed their leader, a man named Victorio. And so the Apache that were remaining also go on to reservations. Now the Buffalo Soldiers, there's a clip just below here that you can watch about the Buffalo Soldiers. They were African American soldiers who were given the nickname Buffalo Soldiers by the Indians, and they saw this as a compliment because they knew that the buffalo were sacred animals to the indigenous peoples. So the Buffalo Soldiers, didn't mind this nickname that was given to them. But they did more than just fight Indian. They were known as the first really national park rangers, and there's a clip here below by the National Park Service about the Buffalo Soldiers, which is super interesting. One of the most important inventions of this time period regarding the West and growth was the invention of barbed wire in 1874. So the reason why this was so important was because before barbed wire, along cattle drives, cattle would graze, on anybody's land, sometimes not their land, and so it was a little controversial on where these cattle drives were taking. They were actually going all the way from South Texas into the Midwest to bring the cattle to the train where they would be taken from there on to the market. But with barbed wire, there were some benefits. And you can see from the slide too, it was initially controversial because it was called like Devil's Hat Band and things like that. But it could allow ranchers to keep livestock off of the farm, and so they would not be grazing on farmland. And it also allowed them to engage in selective breeding, which interestingly enough caused a decline in longhorn, because longhorn actually operated better on open range, and so we actually see a decrease in the number of longhorn that uses that at that time. But it encouraged settlement, really. Barbed wire did, because they knew that their land could be protected, and it was it really transformed the West quite a bit. And you can see the sheer amount, 120 million pounds by 1887 in just those 13 years after its invention. So the other invention that really changes and encourages settlement, and is specifically talking about West Texas at that time, was the revamping of the windmill. The windmill was something that was used to harness power, but it was also used to get, water power. But the problem was that they didn't have a windmill that would be able to dig down deep enough to get down into areas that were extremely arid. And so a lot of people didn't want to move to West Texas just because of the sheer amount of rainfall that didn't exist at that time. And you can see these numbers, right? That in East Texas, it was 30 to 50 inches per, annual rainfall per year. And in West Texas, it's not even half that, right? So there wasn't very much at all. But when there's a more durable windmill that's invented in 1875, it was durable enough and strong enough to where it could really break down even the deepest well, and it allowed them to dig into the Agala aquifer. In West Texas, it encourages a lot more settlement in the West. It also encouraged cotton cultivation in particular, and Texas becomes the biggest cotton producer in the United States by 1900. So the invention of the windmill also encourages people to cultivate Texas land. And you can see from this chart the sheer amount of acreage that Texas is involved in, and how much it increases. And really, it really has to do with these two inventions, right? Barbed wire and the windmill. And you can see this sheer number just increasing a lot, right? So Texas itself, started to figure out how is it going to control this amount of growth that's happening in Texas at this time. So in Texas, we also see the number of counties increase. And we go from like having 24 counties or something like that from, the early colonial era to all the way up to 230. And the reason why we have so many counties is because in 1876 in the Constitution, it actually stated that a county couldn't be more than 900 acres. So they were required by that Constitution not to have too many acres because of that. But with barbed wire came a lot of fencing disputes. There were issues where people were going and cutting wire. And the Texas legislature actually passed a law that said that if you cut wire, that was a felony of up to 1 to 5 years. And so that, stopped wire cutting, or at least there was major policing of it. And the issue was that some people argued that people were fencing in public land that was like public water rights. And the real story behind that is sometimes they did and sometimes it really was under theirs, but they had never fenced it before. And so people didn't bother to get or to try to own water land because some people believe that should just be public land. But either way, it did create quite a bit of fencing disputes. We also see a lot of African Americans moving to East Texas for various reasons, usually for sharecropping. And just to put this in perspective, the sheer number of people that move to Texas increases quite a bit. We go from 1.5, 1.6 million in 1880 to 2.2 million people in 1890 to over 3 million people by 1900. So, a lot of growth in Texas during that time. We also see, especially with barbed wire, the growth of ranching in particular. We know that the cowboy comes from the Spanish vaqueros who really developed the style that we recognize today. And there's also things that help with the cattle drives, like in 1849, the invention of the meat biscuit, which was, a very tough, rugged biscuit that had like dried meat inside of it. And the invention of the meat biscuit also spurs the invention of meat packing plants in Texas to create this meat biscuit. People begin to move west further with the invention of barbed wire, but more specifically really with the windmill, and made it like possible for people to farm in West Texas. And there was like the 100th meridian line, which is is one of the lines of longitude. And we see a lot of people ranching in that area. One of the most famous of those is the ranch up in North Texas, Charles Goodnight's ranch up there. And of course, cattle drives really decreases with, like I mentioned before, the invention of barbed wire fences. But the most famous cattle drive and trail in Texas was, of course, the Chisholm Trail. And there's a clip here below about the Chisholm Trail and about what life was like on a cattle drive. Speaking about what life was like on a cattle drive, I want to talk a moment just about how the West becomes romanticized in popular fiction and how that narrative really started. Really what happens is after the Civil War, we see a golden age of cattle ranching and cowboys, railroad stations in Abilene and Dodge City, Kansas, and places like this become destinations for now legendary cattle drives. The cowboys who worked these drives, we know, were very diverse. They weren't white, just only white men like people have visioned, but they were actually people, a third of them African American, a third of them of Mexican descent, but their life was anything but romantic. It was mainly low-paid workers on long-distance cattle drives that were very treacherous and difficult ways to live. And there were things like they would get unhorsed crossing rivers, and most of them didn't swim, and so they would fall off and they would perish. And that, of course, was not romanticized, but we know that this becomes popularized because just traveling shows like Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, which was a really popular show, romanticized the cowboy life. So did dime novels. Probably one of the most famous dime novels of that time was something known as the Deadwood Dick series. And so I've got an image here on the slide of that. And so, you know, it becomes romanticized through this, and that carries on even arguably through today. So we do know, like I mentioned before, that life was difficult. There was even an incident of a cowboy strike in 1883 in Texas, in which cowboys become very unhappy with the way that they're being paid and their way of life. And so what they would usually get paid with was in calves. Usually in the early times of the cowboy drives, they would be paid in calves, and eventually they'd be able to become ranchers of their own. And that's what they kind of strove for. But as we see these big commercial ranches start to come in, they begin to pay them really low wages. And there was a cowboy strike that was started by a man named Tom Harris from the LS Ranch. He basically gathered up a lot of people, and I think there were close to 200 people that kind of supported this. But in the end, really, it was garnered by 24 different cowboys. They signed this ultimatum on, you know, why they thought they were being mistreated. We know that after 2.5 months, they were essentially, they got defeated. They were blacklisted. And they couldn't get jobs on any other ranch. Because most ranches belonged to various stockmen's association, for many years those ranchers or those cowboys couldn't get jobs as a working hand anywhere. And so, you know, it's interesting that they organized, but sad that they really didn't get anywhere really with it. But that kind of tells you about how life wasn't as romantic as it was pictured, or has been, you know, it's been illustrated in novels and things of that nature. The Texas timber industry grows, especially with the growth of the railroad in Texas. Okay, it calls for wooden timbers to create the rail lines. This is also encouraged because Texas itself passed all kinds of legislation in order to encourage the growth of the railroad. We know that, you know, timber itself was commercially cut mainly in East Texas. Texas becomes the top lumbering state in the United States. And we also know that company towns begin to form. And if you don't know what a company town is, essentially they incorporate or they create a town themselves that they run, the churches, the schools, the whole way of life of the worker. This was really common actually on the East Coast already by something known as like the textile industry towns. And essentially your whole family would work in the factory, and they would control the rent way, how much you paid in rent, and also your wages. It was seen as particularly controlling, but this does happen with the Texas timber industry, specifically mostly in East Texas as well. Kirby Lumber is probably was the largest one at that time period in Texas. And like I mentioned before, the fact the railroad really is significant in Texas. Texas becomes the leading nation in rail lines in 1877. It laid more tracks than any other states combined in that year, really post-Civil War. If you think about the sheer size of Texas and with the other inventions that happened, this causes massive growth in Texas at that time. You can see the number. In 1875, there were only 1,650 miles. By 1900, 10,000 miles of rail lines in Texas. And so really, some people think that these were like small town people that were getting into the game of rail lines, but the reality was these were big businessmen that had brought over and controlled the railroads. And most specifically, Jay Gould is one of the most infamous of them all. And in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about big business, the Gilded Age, and how it affects Texas. I'm also going to talk about it broadly in national terms, like how it affected the United States in general, because that, of course, has an effect here in Texas, about the particular movements, labor unions, the populist party that forms, that was a conglomeration of farmers that spoke up and addressed their concerns. So I'll talk about that in the next lecture, but I'll leave off right here on this one.